At the time of making this video, exactly 2,400 years have passed since the death of one of the most famous historical figures. A magnificent warrior, general, and king, Alexander the Great doesn't really need much introduction. There is, indeed, no lack of literature and material about this famous ruler. Most, if not all conquerors who came after him, strive to reach his glory. But though his name and achievements have reached many history books and present school curriculums, there remains an abundance of murky details about his life. This is not helped by ancient sources, of which reliability has been justifiably questioned. After Alexander's death, many people aspired to enforce their own version of Alexander to be the definitive truth, and some even worked tirelessly to undo everything that was of him. Of ancient sources, we have only those written centuries later by people trying, some more successfully than others, to separate the truth from the legend. Yes, even then, that was a difficult task. Plutarch, Trocus, Diodorus and Curtius are just few names which are linked with upholding some record of Alexander that are available to us today. But in the 2nd century AD, an event, or rather, a person appeared, who historians would consider a gift. His name was Lucius Flavius Arrianus, best known simply as Arrian. He was a Romanized Bithynian Greek, and was given many honors in his lifetime, political and otherwise, though he never reached any long-lasting fame. Today, his name largely isn't connected with his governorship, military command, or many written texts, except for one. That which is today still considered the best ancient source about Alexander the Great, even though many doubts and critics have been cast upon it, and it should still be taken with a grain of salt and judged with common sense. Arrian titled his work, The Anabasis of Alexander. Anabasis means an expedition from a coastline into the interior of a country or a journey up country from the sea. Arrian took for himself the title and even the name of the author of an even earlier Anabasis, that of Xenophon, an ancient Greek military leader, philosopher, and contemporary of Plato. There could be many parallels drawn between Arrian and Xenophon, but this won't be done here. This series will attempt to cover the entire Arrian scripture about Alexander the Great. Filled with additional outside information about Alexander and his armies, Arrian, and other involved historical figures, it will not only aim to present why Alexander's path was so impressive, but also provide more background to the events and additional context where the great written source about Alexander can fall short. Before diving into it, another thing must be said. Alexander the Great is a heavily romanticized person of history, and reconstructing his historical life is as problematic as trying to historically reconstruct Jesus Christ. His life until ascending to the throne is even murkier, as Arrian skips that period. Layers and layers of research, essays, and books were written about Alexander's nature and what he could have been really like. But the short and simple answer is that we will probably never know the whole story. For every history enthusiast, there is a version of Alexander they keep in their head. We will never have an entire, clear picture of him, but what we have is worth being retold for the sake of Alexander's achievements themselves, as well as those who would learn about him today. To start, Arrian begins his work with the following preface. I have admitted into my narrative, as strictly authentic, all the statements relating to Alexander and Philip, which Ptolemy, son of Lagus, and Aristobulus, son of Aristobulus, agree in making. And from those statements which differ I have selected that which appears to me the more credible and at the same time the more deserving of record. Different authors have given different accounts of Alexander's life, and there is no one about whom more have written, or more at variance with each other. But in my opinion the narratives of Ptolemy and Aristobulus are more worthy of credit than the rest. Aristobulus, because he served under King Alexander in his expedition, and Ptolemy, not only because he accompanied Alexander in his expedition, but also because he was himself a king afterwards, and falsification of facts would have been more disgraceful to him than to any other man. Moreover, they are both more worthy of credit, because they compiled their histories after Alexander's death, when neither compulsion was used nor reward offered them to write anything different from what really occurred. Some statements made by other writers I have incorporated in my narrative, because they seem to me worthy of mention and not altogether improbable, but I have given them merely as reports of Alexander's proceedings. In this part, Arrian describes the sources he uses and why he picked them. Arrian's text, as well as his choice of sources, have been analyzed in depth by many historians, with a mixture of praise and criticism. And even he, living in a time far closer to Alexander than us, calls out the difficulty of extrapolating facts from what was already becoming a legend. What we can hold against Arrian is that, at his own discretion, he chose the source he himself judged more credible and more deserving of record. While it is hard to argue Arrian's experience, and that he should be given a benefit of the doubt, considering the lack of technology, data, and empirical research at today's standard, it is understandable why Anabasis of Alexander can't be taken as facts and why its integrity is doubted by modern scholars. As for his chosen sources, Aristobulus was a patriotic Macedonian, despite having Greek heritage. A what we would today call interior designer by profession, and also an engineer and an architect, Aristobulus accompanied Alexander on his journey and was tasked, for example, with the rebuilding of Cyrus the Great's desecrated tomb, among other things. His greatest drawback as a writer about Alexander's conquest was that of flattery and painting Alexander in the best possible image, despite his flaws and impulses. This didn't seem to bother Arrian much, nor other writers who often reference Aristobulus' work. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, is an even more interesting and challenging source. A childhood friend and companion to Alexander, despite being 10 years older than the young prince, Ptolemy rose to the position of marshal within Alexander's army. He was a skilled military commander and his loyalty to Alexander was unquestionable. Ptolemy's recollection, which he wrote as an old man, is perhaps the most important reference work about Alexander from any ancient author. After all, Ptolemy was there with him. Moreover, he was Alexander's companion, one of his commanders, a member of his inner circle, one of his most trusted advisors, and his friend. Few were as close to Alexander. The sad situation is that no copy of Ptolemy's work was preserved, not one. All we have are references and quotes transcribed by other authors. While his work was probably copied across the ancient world, it is now lost. The most prominent repositories of knowledge, where such work could be hidden more than millennium after its creation, were destroyed. And while such a destruction of cultural heritage isn't the sole reason for the loss of historical records, the result stays the same. However, by combining fragments of Ptolemy's history of Alexander's campaigns, historians and experts tried and continue to try recreating any small chunk of what used to be the go-to chronicle of the mighty Alexander. It is Arrian's reasoning for choosing Ptolemy's work as a principal source that has put into question his own integrity as a historian. Besides being a close eyewitness to the campaign, Arrian chose Ptolemy because he was also a king, meaning he would not, lie in his recount. At least, that's what Arrian believed. It's easy to call Arrian naive, but under closer inspection, there is more to it. Arrian doesn't simply call upon Ptolemy's integrity, honor, and other values befit of an ancient king. Even Arrian would be able to see that Ptolemy had very much to gain by writing his own history of Alexander. After all, this very history would show Ptolemy in the best light and provide legitimacy to his rule. What Arrian is referring to by his integral belief in Ptolemy's recount, even if in a more subtle way, is a simple truth. Along with Ptolemy, many of his rival successors and others who served under Alexander were still very much alive at the time when Ptolemy wrote his histories. The memory of Alexander was still fresh enough and facts not too obscured, so anyone could call him out on a lie. And Ptolemy, as a king who built his rule on the cornerstone of Alexander, couldn't afford that. Sure, he could have kept his work a secret, but for what purpose? One of the largest purposes his memoirs served was that of reinforcing his legitimacy. A secret diary couldn't do that very well. All of the Diadochi wanted to reflect the glory and reputation of Alexander. By writing, Ptolemy most probably attempted to do what all other Alexander's successors tried, build their own domains and legacies. Vastly oversimplifying, while it definitely served Ptolemy's ambition to recollect and publish his history of Alexander, lying about the past events wouldn't have. This extensive chronicle, the long-lasting dynasty, and the act of kidnapping of Alexander's dead body and placing it in Egypt. He stepped up over his rival successors who named themselves kings, by also making himself pharaoh. The dynasty he founded in Egypt would outlast those of all other Diadochi. Besides showcasing Ptolemy's ambition, all these factors justifiably place him as the most famous of Alexander's successors in history. Without a doubt, Ptolemy can reasonably be accused of bias and bending history to his benefit, especially when it comes to crediting other generals and successors of Alexander. But Arrian's reasoning as to proclaiming him a reliable source, even to be used as the main source, is more pragmatic and less naive than it seems at the first glance. The connection of Arrian's and Ptolemy's works is also illustrated right at the beginning. Arrian begins Anabasis of Alexander at the time of his ascension to the throne, as most probably did Ptolemy's work. Arrian also notes other sources, beyond the two discussed before, but rarely mentions them by name upon reference. He concludes his preface by writing, "And if any man wonders why, after so many other men have written of Alexander, the compilation of this history came into my mind. After perusing the narratives of all the rest, let him read this of mine, and then wonder, if he can." This last part tells us more about Arrian. It is without a doubt that Arrian was a great writer, an enthusiast of philosophy, history, and literature. A man proficient with governance, politics, military, and logistics. All of this he was aware of, and he is not afraid to show expertise and pride over his work and skill. Arrian even challenges the reader to judge his work only after reading other works. To him, this is more than yet another history of Alexander. To modern historians, Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander would be the magnum opus of a talented Roman statesman, one with self-aware, qualified understanding of ancient statehood and military affairs. After this preface, Arrian jumps right into the action, with the ascension of Alexander to the throne. It is said that Philip died when Pythodemus was archon at Athens, and that his son Alexander, being then about 20 years of age, marched into Peloponnesus as soon as he had secured the regal power. There he assembled all the Greeks who were within the limits of Peloponnesus, and asked from them the supreme command of the expedition against the Persians, an office which they had already conferred upon Philip. He received the honor which he asked from all except the Lacedaemonians, who replied that it was an hereditary custom of theirs not to follow others, but to lead them. The Athenians also attempted to bring about some political change, but they were so alarmed at the very approach of Alexander, that they conceded to him even more ample public honors than those which had been bestowed upon Philip. He then returned into Macedonia and busied himself in preparing for the expedition into Asia. Book 1 opens with the death of Alexander's father, King Philip II of Macedonia. Arrian didn't delve too deep into this event, and neither will these videos, but some context behind the event deserves to be clarified. It is said that Philip was assassinated by one of his personal bodyguards, a young noble named Pausanias. It happened at the celebration in honor of marriage between Alexander's sister, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus, who was also a brother of Queen Olympias, Alexander's mother. In a weird twist of fate, the king of Epirus, who was also named Alexander, was now Alexander the Great's uncle and brother-in-law. The further circumstance that Cleopatra was marrying her uncle was no impediment during those times. At the event, Pausanias approached Philip and stabbed him with a Celtic dagger through his ribs. Then he sprinted for the gates and the horses he had made ready for his escape, but stumbled and the pursuing guards killed him on the spot. The outcome of Philip's assassination was straightforward, unlike the circumstances and motives behind it. It is possible that Alexander the Great and Queen Olympias had a part in it, be it directly or indirectly. Olympias certainly didn't hide her approval afterwards. Whatever the case, Philip's death left the throne of Macedonia empty. Alexander, then little over 20 years old, didn't slack and seized it with vigor and determination. He opened his reign in a traditional Macedonian way, by eliminating his competition. The most prominent victim was his cousin Amyntas, who under more organized succession laws would be king. He was a full-blooded Macedonian royal, unlike Alexander with his barbarian mother from Epirus, which, at the time, was far less Hellenized and was looked down on by other Greeks. Philip's latest wife and their 2 children were also killed, most probably by Olympias. Another victim was Attalus, a Macedonian general who led their forces into Asia Minor for the upcoming campaign against Persia, but had a strong chance to lead a rebellion against Alexander. The time of assassination, autumn of 336 BC, can be determined by the name of the contemporary archon of Athens. Historians of antiquity didn't have a universal system for tracking passing years, so instead they used names of Athenian archons or Roman consuls, which served 1-year terms. Interestingly, such numbering has allowed past and present archaeologists to more accurately date artifacts that were found along the coins minted during a reign of such official. A year prior to his death, King Philip managed to enroll all mainland Greek states into a joint military organization simply called the League, but dubbed League of Corinth by modern historians, due to its meeting location. This league included 2 of the 3 strongest remaining Greek states, Athens and Thebes, which Philip defeated at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where Alexander also played a prominent role as a cavalry commander, breaking the enemy line. The third state, Lacedaemonians of Sparta, which did not partake in the Battle of Chaeronea and were in decline from its glory days, were left off the hook for now. Philip was on the surface only the League's so-called enforcer, executing League's policy. But in reality, he was its most proactive force and guide. Among the League's first acts was the appointment of Philip as the commanding general, strategos, of the upcoming Greek campaign into Asia against the Persian Empire. In truth, Philip was preparing for such an invasion already before the appointment. Now it only became official, with the League as its sponsor. Philip's death was seen by the Greeks as a liberation. The assassin was even awarded state honors by Athens. The cheer was not long-lasting though. Alexander quickly marched into Greece with his army to restore order, and the League passed on his father's title of strategos of the Asian expedition onto him. Alexander, while a new king, was not a fresh face to war, nor leadership. This series of events and the quick change of face by Athenians taught Alexander that the Greeks could be intimidated, but never fully brought over to the Macedonian cause. They would always seek openings and weaknesses in Alexander's grip to free themselves of the Macedonian oppression. Arrian continues. At the approach of spring, 335 BC, he marched towards Thrace, into the lands of the Tribalians and Illyrians, because he ascertained that these nations were meditating a change of policy, and at the same time, as they were lying on his frontier, he thought it inexpedient to leave them behind him without being entirely subjugated when he was about to start on a campaign so far away from his own land. Setting out then from Amphipolis, he invaded the land of the people who were called independent Thracians, keeping the city of Philippi and Mount Orbulus on the left. Crossing the river Nessus, they say he arrived at Mount Haemus on the 10th day. Here, along the defiles up the ascent to the mountain, he was met by many of the traders equipped with arms, as well as by the independent Thracians, who had made preparations to check the further advance of his expedition by seizing the summit of Haemus, along which was the route for the passage of his army. They had collected their wagons, and placed them in front of them, not only using them as a rampart from which they might defend themselves in case they should be forced back, but also intending to let them loose upon the phalanx of the Macedonians where the mountain was most precipitous, if they tried to ascend. They had come to the conclusion that the denser the phalanx was with which the wagons rushing down came into collision, the more easily would they scatter it by the violence of their fall upon it. Greek states were not the only ones that rebelled against the Macedonian oversight now that Philip was dead. Alexander turned northeast towards Thrace and the tribe of Tribaloi, in order to quell the revolt, secure Macedonian hinterlands, and communication line with Asia-bound forces. The unsubdued Tribalians lived beyond the mountains, in the riverland of the Ister, present-day Danube. They had a past with Alexander's father, whom they jumped and inflicted on him a crippling wound when he was returning from a march on Byzantium. Now Alexander would strike back. He marched into the land of the free Thracians, free only in regard that Philip hasn't entirely subdued them beforehand. Alexander met them at the Mount Haemus or Haemus Pass. Despite Arrian's description, modern historians still debate the exact route Alexander would have taken to reach this point, where the enemy had the high ground advantage, as well as wagons that could be used defensively or offensively. Most probably, the standoff occurred at present-day Shipka Pass, Bulgaria. And as Arrian first uses the term here, a quick explanation of phalanx is in order. In short, it is a main body of Macedonian infantry, already established by Philip. It was formed into a rectangular block, fighting and moving in unison. But there is more to it. Before Philip, Macedonia already had a strong cavalry, but lacked a proper infantry. In the first decade of his rule, in the 350s BC, with his ambition to raise Macedonia from a barbarian backwater state into a Greek powerhouse, Philip used the military knowledge he gained as a hostage in the court of Thebes. He completely transformed Macedonian infantry from a poorly equipped and trained band of commoners, into a force capable of competing even with the most organized heavy infantry of Greek states. He employed strong, vigorous Macedonian youths from the lower classes, and equipped them with a new kind of spear, the sarissa, which could reach beyond 16 feet, or around 5 meters. With such a weapon, however, the phalangites, the infantrymen, had to abandon the classic heavy shield of hoplites, instead fighting with a smaller, flatter one. Each phalangite recruit was paid enough to be a part of Philip's new standing army year-round. They were either following Philip in his campaigns or drilling in the parade grounds of Pella, the capital of Macedonia, reaching extremely high levels of coordination and mastery of military maneuvers. Many of them would remain in service throughout Philip's and into Alexander's reign, some of them ranking up more than 20 years of experience. Upon Alexander's ascension, a phalanx of infantry companions would surpass the legendary Spartan forces in their ability to hold formation and execute coordinated movements, even in intense battles. They would need all these qualities in the following battle, the first one under Alexander as king. Armed with this capable force, Alexander faced the opposing Thracians. Arrian continues. But Alexander formed a plan by which he might cross the mountain with the least danger possible. And since he was resolved to run all risks, knowing that there were no means of passing elsewhere, he ordered the heavy-armed soldiers to open their ranks as soon as the wagons began to rush down the declivity, and he directed that those for whom the road was sufficiently wide to permit to do so should stand apart, so that the wagons might roll through the gap. But those who were hemmed in on all sides should either stoop down together or even fall flat on the ground, and lock their shields compactly together, so that the wagons rushing down upon them, and in all probability by their very impetus leaping over them, might pass on without injuring them. And it turned out just as Alexander had conjectured and exhorted. For some of the men made gaps in the phalanx, and others locked their shields together. The wagons rolled over the shields without doing much injury, not a single man being killed under them. Then the Macedonians regained their courage, inasmuch as the wagons, which they had excessively dreaded, had inflicted no damage upon them. With a loud cry they assaulted the Thracians. Alexander ordered his archers to march from the right wing in front of the rest of the phalanx, because there the passage was easier, and to shoot at the Thracians where they advanced. He himself took his own guard, the shield-bearing infantry and the Arrianians, and led them to the left. Then the archers shot at the Thracians who sallied forward, and repulsed them, and the phalanx, coming to close fighting, easily drove away from their position men who were light-armed and badly equipped barbarians. The consequence was, they no longer waited to receive Alexander marching against them from the left, but casting away their arms, they fled down the mountain as each man best could. About 1,500 of them were killed, but only a few were taken prisoners on account of their swiftness of foot and acquaintance with the country. However, all the women who were accompanying them were captured, as were also their children and all their booty. Arrian mentioned phalanx before, and now brings up other types of units and soldiers, specifically his own guard, the shield-bearing infantry, and the Arrianians. His own guard is a rough translation of the term agema. Another similar term would be honor guard, but it challenges the usual first impression of such a unit. These were not simply Alexander's bodyguards, standing intimidatingly around a palace in polished armor, there to impress visitors and block threats from reaching Alexander. Instead, these light-armored infantry units had a major combat-centered function and were best of the best. There was also cavalry agema, depending on whether Alexander was fighting on horseback or on foot. The 1,000-men agema was a top-notch subdivision of a 3,000-man strong unit formation of shield-bearers. This group was an elite corps with lighter equipment than the heavy infantry of phalanx, focused on mobility, probably to better protect phalanx's flank and form a bridge between it and the faster cavalry. These were highly capable men with high strength, speed, and stamina. They would be the ones most often chosen for physical taxing challenges and fast pursuits. The Arrianians were allies of Macedonia, located in the Balkans, northeast of it. They usually formed reliable, light infantry of high quality and were often given important tasks and special operations to perform. They were already used by Philip II, and the Arrianian king, Langaros, was well disposed toward Alexander. We will see more of him and Arrianians later on. As for the battle, such tactics and defense against rushing carts might today seem like common sense, even to those not versed in military maneuvers. But against a foe that has a high ground advantage, and in a hostile land where Philip himself has been defeated, any force could justifiably hesitate. But the Macedon army proved its quality by quick, disciplined, and responsive actions and followed Alexander with utmost trust. The first military victory of Alexander as king was a huge success, though it would become eclipsed by those yet to come. But this victory is perhaps as remarkable as any of them, not just because of masterful discipline and performance in a difficult terrain, but even more so because no man was lost in the engagement. With the benefit of hindsight and a little imagination, one could go so far to even see this shield maneuver as one of the first iterations of Roman turtle formation that would dominate European warfare centuries later. With this victory over Thracians in the mountains, the valley of Danube sprawled ahead of them. Alexander and his army proved themselves to each other, but this was only the first challenge in a line of many.